Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
It is my great pleasure to follow up on yesterday's opening remarks from Professor Stang, Professor Cusack, and Alexander de Zaldeman to warmly welcome all of you today. My name is Gosia Sklodowska, and I have the privilege of serving as the executive director here at the center. My brief remarks mark a small adjustment to today's program. Professor Stang and I hoped to bring some variety to the voices representing the center throughout the conference. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's introductory and context-setting sessions and are delighted to see you here for the main program. Today's schedule features 2 keynote speakers, Professor Cusack in the morning and Alexander de Zaldeman later in the day, 4 panels with 14 speakers, and concludes with a piano recital of Gurdjieff and the Hartmann music at the Epsworth Church. The church is located a few minutes away from here, and our team of volunteers and staff will be around right after the conclusion of the last panel for the day to walk you to the church. The conference celebrates a historic milestone, the centenary of Gurdjieff's visit to the United States with his 23 students in 1924. Their tour included stops in Chicago, New York, and here in Boston and Harvard, where they introduced Gurdjieff's teachings and the Institute not only through conventional lectures, but also through the unique medium of movements. Movements were introduced to the press as demonstrations of ancient music and dance, exercises, tricks and half-tricks, and even supernatural phenomena drawn from Gurdjieff's explorations in the Far East. The avant-garde and intelligentsia milieu of the time, drawn to the exotic, the oriental, and the mystical, was both fascinated and quite frankly perplexed by Gurdjieff's approach and his own persona. Press reactions often focused on the sensational, veering into distortion or even condescension, as was clear to us when we were watching yesterday's documentary and looking at sample titles from the newspapers. Following the response from the press in the US, but also in Europe preceding his travels, Gurdjieff largely abstained from using choreography as the primary introduction to the Institute. But one can argue that inside he was not troubled by the reaction of the general public. In fact, he might have sought to provoke it on purpose, putting his Diogenean persona on full display. It is clear from recollections of his pupils, as noted in Roger Lipsy's book, Gurdjieff Reconsidered, that Gurdjieff was intent on engaging and retaining select few who were willing to engage deeply and in a rigorous way with his ideas to uncover their transformative potential. I'm going to quote here from Roger's book. After the meeting, I asked Mr. Gurdjieff. I looked out at the audience and saw that half of the people were not even looking interested and looked quite asleep. Why do you allow all these people? Wouldn't it be better to have fewer people who are interested? Mr. Gurdjieff answered me, how can you judge? Perhaps those who seem asleep today, in 20 years, something will be awakened in them. And those who now seem so eager will forget in 10 days. We have to let everyone hear. The rest does not belong to us. I believe that all of us here today, whether in person or online, awoke to Gurdjieff's teachings and share the commitment to go beyond the superficial, the fake, the sensational, and the habitual, delving deeply into the work. For many of our speakers and scholars, and many of you in the audience, the fourth way is not merely a philosophy or a passing curiosity, but a way of life, a path to harmonious development for individuals and for all of humanity. Hosting this conference at the Center for the Study of World Religions feels profoundly fitting. As today's speakers, including Richard Temple and Joseph Azizi, explore in their papers, Gurdjieff's teachings resonate with a lineage of philosophical and spiritual traditions such as Platonism, Neoplatonism, Orthodox Christianity, Sufi mysticism, and alchemy. These traditions are central to the core mission at the center and to our interests, and Gurdjieff's influence naturally intertwines with our recent programs, from conferences like Adventures in the Imaginal, Henri Corbin for the 21st Century, and most recently Platonism as a Living Tradition, as well as our upcoming events on the poet, writer, and translator Philip Sherard, and his efforts to make the riches of the Hesychast tradition available to wider audiences through an English translation of the Philokalia. This centennial offers an opportunity to honor Gurdjieff's multifaceted legacy, a legacy spanning diverse interpretations and practices. When introduced to American public, his institute was only a few years old. Over the past century, his teachings have evolved and diversified, sparking dialogue and sometimes disagreements among groups and lineages. This evolution mirrors the challenges faced by many spiritual traditions, balancing preservation of core teachings with openness to growth, desire to attract new followers while retaining core members, and harmonizing tradition with innovation. Central to Gurdjieff's philosophy is the harmony of the three centers, mind, heart, and body. While our today's program engages us intellectually, we have also made an effort to incorporate other dimensions through panels, individual presentation topics, the piano recital, and of course the movement workshops leading us to this event. These workshops, led by the Gurdjieff Society of Massachusetts with instruction from Professor Langmuir, have provided a space for embodied exploration, complementing our intellectual inquiry. This conference, as Professor Stang mentioned yesterday, is the result of nearly 2 years of meticulous planning. From the outset, we embraced the possibility of disagreement and prepared for some degree of productive dissonance in this room. And to be candid, we ourselves and our planning team occasionally faced some what we called harmonious disagreements. But what united us was a spirit of openness, mutual respect, and a shared belief in the value of this gathering. We hope it enables all of you and the groups that you're part of, which might not otherwise interact, to engage, discover common threads, and forge connections. We acknowledge that today's program cannot fully capture the depth and expertise of our speakers. With only 15 minutes per talk, we encourage you to think of their presentations as an introduction and an invitation to explore their work, their books, publications further, to connect with them and with each other during our lunch break, coffee breaks, and continue discussions well beyond this forum. Finally, I want to express heartfelt gratitude to our close collaborators and partners, with special thanks to Cynthia Reeves, Roger Lipsey, and Professor Langmuir, whose contributions have been instrumental in planning this event. I also deeply appreciate the efforts of the center's dedicated team, Bashwar Khan, Laurie Sedgwick, and Sarah Ionotti. I'm very grateful to Charles for his very gracious comments yesterday, but I personally feel that really we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the really dedication and efforts of Laurie, Bashwar, and Sarah. They've been working tirelessly on this event for months, weeks, days, possibly even nights. So a big thanks to them. And thank you also for a committed group of volunteers who were with us yesterday and today. It's now my great honor to introduce Professor Carole Cusack, our visiting scholar at the center and a professor of religious studies at the University of Sydney. Professor Cusack's unparalleled expertise in Western esotericism and her deep familiarity with Gurdjieff's tradition have been invaluable every step along the way. She will also edit the forthcoming anthology based on the proceedings from today's conference, set for release in early 2025. And with this, please join me in welcoming Professor Cusack to the podium. Thank you.
I'm discussing today the way that Gurdjieff and the work can be studied by academics. This is, I think, not such a contentious topic as it was perhaps 20 or 40 years ago. And I concur that the tensions nowadays tend to be productive rather than destructive. And it's part of a bigger conversation within the discipline of religious studies. From the very beginning, from its inception in the 19th century, there were questions about the idea of studying religion from a perspective apart from that of personal faith. And this is still a powerful dialectic in our field. So the idea of the confessional discourse, the discourse of the committed follower, as opposed to the outsider, the external, is a tension that has resonated for a long time. But I'm going to take as my jumping off point the year 1980, when James Webb's book, The Harmonious Circle, which was the first book about Gurdjieff that attempted to write anything serious, researched, thoughtful, verified by evidence by an outsider. So in a way, that book is the ancestor of a lot of the work that I have done over the years, and it certainly feeds into some of my colleagues. So, as well as religious studies, there is, of course, Western esotericism. And I think probably I could have added maybe philosophy into the mix, but I situate the work at a confluence of religious studies, Western esotericism, and psychology primarily. And I think that that is a productive place, a kind of intersection where things arise. This is important, actually, because scholars have always known that they need the insiders. They need the people who are engaged in the tradition. Otherwise, there's nothing to study. Well, that's not quite true. There are, of course, texts. And if all the people disappeared from the world, there would still be the texts, and we could read them and wonder what it was like to be a believer in a community, a practitioner in a discipline. But of course, anthropology is a discipline that has fed into religious studies, and from its inception in the 19th century, the idea of the researcher approaching a community that is not his or her own and seeking permission to study, to live with, to walk alongside the members of that community, and to produce truthful, sympathetic, though not apologetic, accounts of their practices, their ideas, their behaviors, the things they hold sacred, the things they dismiss, the way in which the boundaries of this alien community rub up against the boundaries of academic scholarship. This is an inheritance we all live with. And I think it's significant, of course, that anthropology nowadays looks a bit colonialist, and we see that white people went to work with non-white people generally. And nowadays, we, as scholars, approach communities that may live just down the road from us and seek to understand what it is that they're doing. So when I think about James Webb, I think that some of the things that are still unaddressed scholarly lacunae in the study of the work were first raised by him. And I might, if I were feeling a little bit perhaps given to overstatement, say that to date, a lot of our academic work about Gurdjieff has been a sequence of footnotes to Webb, and we could probably keep footnoting him and looking at things that he raised as possible projects but was not able to complete. So Western esotericism is itself a contentious term, and of course Gurdjieff presented as uniting Eastern and Western wisdom, traditions, approaches to life. And there's a lot of decolonizing work going on in Western esotericism at the moment. But all of the things that Favre proposed in 1994 are still relevant. The idea of symbolic and real correspondences, the macrocosm, the microcosm, living nature, the way the world is like an energy accumulator, imagination and mediation, things like the movements and the music which mediate access. The idea of transmutation, of being entirely changed in one's substance. The praxis of concordance, bringing together the East, the West, insights from Sufism, insights from Christianity, insights from Platonic philosophy, and the idea of transmission from a teacher to an initiate, all fit, I think, the field very, very well. And of course, our dilemma, in a very crude way, is that the Enlightenment principle was that knowledge is free and readily available to everyone. And of course, some cultures don't see that. Knowledge is proprietary. It belongs to a particular culture. That's just how it is. I'm not really going to talk much about the material on this page. You'll be able to look at it online if you want later on. What it talks about is, though, how harsh, how rigid that division between the insider and the outsider needs to be viewed as. After all of us are insiders and outsiders in multiple ways. There are people, like myself, for example, brought up in a pretty strong Christian tradition, Roman Catholicism. My Irish surname should give it away. But I left. Nevertheless, it's not easy to extract the education, the conditioning, the practice, the ideas that I was raised in by extremely devout parents. People leave the work. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't come back. Sometimes people write accounts of their experiences while in a group. Other times they write their accounts after they have left. Both feet are in one camp, the insider, the outsider. The other thing that, of course, the scholar can do with the generosity of the community is actually be part of activities that the community engages with. This is something we have been fortunate to do this semester. It doesn't make us outsiders in any full sense, but it provides sensations, experiences, a window onto that thing. Now, I think it's really important. My favorite quote on this slide is the last one, the absolutely astonishing article by Jeppe Sinding Jensen in 2011, in which he said we should really stop worrying too much about these divisions anyway, because all it really demonstrates is the plain fact that knowledge is unevenly distributed across subjects. A new person training to convert to Catholicism does not have the same knowledge or experience as someone who's been a Catholic for 60 years. Now, what is gained by studying Gurdjieff? Well, everybody knows that there are several different ways to read Meetings with Remarkable Men. Some people might want to read it as a kind of straight history. I don't think it is. If it's an autobiography, it's a heavily symbolic, playful, reflexive kind of text. And James Webb proposed two ways of reading it, one of which was to search for historical nuggets, which is a way, of course, that many Gurdjieff groups have approached the text over the years. But his other way, which I think is something that could really be done and is one of these unfinished projects, was to look at each character, each remarkable man, and ask whether he is not one of the eyes of Gurdjieff that later integrated into the single eye that is Gurdjieff. That is a psychological reading, a symbolic reading. It is yet to be done. What do scholars bring to the study? Well, we bring models of leadership, we bring comparative context, that's something Webb excelled at, and we bring conceptual frameworks that pull the work into relation with other types of movement. This quote is important only for the fact that it is an advocacy for comparative work, It's something that a lot of people feel uncomfortable about now, but as Jensen says, typology and genealogy are ways in which different material can be brought together. So here he is, and here's his book, The Harmonious Circle, an exploration of the life and work of G.I. Gurdjieff, P.D. Uspensky, and others. It took 8 years to write this book. It was finished in 1978. He began it in 1971 after his first book, which was called Flight from Reason, was published. It was later republished as The Occult Underground in 1974. He also published another major book, The Occult Establishment, in 1976. These books are prescient. They lead to the field of Western esotericism. They also tie in with cruder works, some of which were by authors who were also influenced by Gurdjieff. I think especially of Stuart Holroyd and Colin Wilson, who were writing at the same time about the occult, about the rejected knowledge, a phrase taken up by Walter Hanegraaff, one of the most important members of the scholars that study Western esotericism, but it was first coined by Webb in The Flight from Reason. The incredible thing is he suicided in 1980, the year this book was released, and he was only 34 years old. It is terrible and tragic what he might have achieved, and this is one reason why perhaps the projects he has left should be taken up by us to keep progressing his investigation. Another tragedy is that his papers, his notes, everything that he had for the book were destroyed by his distraught widow after his suicide. So, what are we looking for? Common threads, areas of difference. The first thing that I'd like to say about this kind of perspective is I've already tried in all of my work to work in non-controversial areas of work studies. I don't practice. I'm not an ex-member. I'm not a member. I'm interested in intentional communities. I'm interested in cultural productions. I'm interested in the way that intellectual currents pick up on other centers of excitement, of interest. This is my interest, and it means that I occupy what I would call a non-controversial stance and space most of the time. There are other questions that are a lot more difficult and about what belongs properly to an initiatory tradition. One of the problems with that, though, is that we are all a product of literacy. And it's worth pointing out, this is an insight from religious studies, that all new religions, I don't think the work is in fact a religion, it is compatible with certain religious paths should people want to pursue. And that's why we can use the tools from religious studies. But just about all new religious movements claim to be returning to a source, which is a claim that the work engages with. One of the interesting things is, of course, that all new religious movements are in fact products of their own time. They are products of modernity. And I think one of the things I'm going to work on next is ideas about how Gurdjieff engaged with modernity in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think there's a lot of really productive, important things to do there. Again, going back to Webb, he came up with some of this really brilliant material, pointing out the different intellectual currents in Russia in particular, where Gurdjieff and his companions like Uspensky, fellow Russians, would have been aware not only of Madame Blavatsky, who gets talked about all the time, but of people like Pavel Alexandrovich Florensky, who published The Pillar and Foundation of Truth in 1914, and of course of the Orthodox saint V.P. Sventitsky, who published a book in 1913 called The Hermits of the Caucasus. Both of these men were from the Caucasus. They were from Gurdjieff's local area, and they were 20 years younger than him if we take the 1860 birth date, but they were very obviously aware of what he was doing, as indeed were other thinkers like Soloviev probably, and maybe even Lev Shestov, and later on, of course, Muraviev. And so there are chains of contact and common material to investigate. So one of the things that's interesting is what we can use as materials, as starting points for our research. Actually, the work is an astonishingly rich field of published material. There is nothing like the pupil memoirs that you have produced, those of you who are in the work, in, for example, anthroposophy. It just does not exist. They don't write personal accounts. And so it's harder to access experiential ideas about what individual anthroposophists take from their engagement with Steiner's teaching. In recent years, of course, Gurdjieff's lectures and talks have been published. The internet is a game changer. There's so much stuff here. And if anyone's here from the Nyland group, what you have done with your digital archives is so staggering. I still have to pick myself up off the floor and figure out how much I can actually engage with them. I think I told the first person who emailed to say what was happening that I would probably have died before I could read or listen my way through most of the material that is there. But it's incredibly rich. It's very valuable. And so this blurs another line between what we're supposed to see and what we're not supposed to see. So what we know, what we're not supposed to know, public knowledge versus proprietary knowledge. So we can, as scholars, access texts. We bring paradigms and methodologies from religious studies, esotericism studies, literary criticism, heritage studies, and there are other academic disciplines, psychology, philosophy, that are useful too. Work members and ex-members constantly swell our library shelves with material which is of greater and lesser value, but nevertheless always interesting. So I just want to finish by saying thanks so much for listening to me. I believe this is a landmark event. I don't know if you know, but we got 500 people on Zoom last night, and our Zoom level has been raised to 1,000 for today. And this is truly amazing, and I am so happy and grateful that the Gurdjieff Society of Massachusetts and Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions saw fit to make this happen. Thank you.
CSWR.HDS.Harvard.edu copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.